to 10 years. I remember when I joined Shell, which was about 20 years ago now, in the organizational change practice. And we were doing a really good warm-up energizer. It was a meeting, there was about 100 of us, looking at how to transform the European retail business. And everybody had to take their initials of their name. So mine was D and R, okay? And then you had to come up with 2 words using your name initials that somehow related to the subject of the meeting. So me, I had demand revolution. I thought that would be a really good energizing way to open a meeting. So it's just a good little technique that you guys might want to use as well. So I was demand revolution, but boy, way back when, 20 years, what is it like today? And just a few words from me about how I do see change is changing. The first thing is it is now ongoing. So even 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, I would be doing, let's do change management. There is a project. Sorry, Antonio, but there was a one-off. We've got to come in, and then it's going to end, and then we'll go back to what it was like before, and then we'll, maybe another change will come in 5 years. But I think we're all now in this whole era of ongoing change. So it is now a question of how do you lead change in an ongoing way. The other dimension, which is really key to me, is the whole nature of disruption. Oops, let's go back one. This whole notion around something suddenly comes into our universe. I don't know if people know the Doctor Who and the Daleks, but I love this cartoon that really just emphasizes this notion around, you think you're going on one track and then suddenly something happens and, the world is dramatically different. So I'm always very curious now about how do you lead from the emerging future rather than lead from the past that you actually know. The third thing I would say is that change is now much more interdependent. So gone are the days where you could unilaterally control what you are up to. So Antonio has just spoken about ecosystems. We now live in ecosystems. So you can't manage change now in a way where you are in direct control anymore. So it's ongoing, it's disruptive, and you can't control it anymore. At the same time, the traditional methods of leading change are fast getting out of date. Hierarchies are collapsing. We've been hearing about the millennials coming into the workforce to want, different things from work. So command and control hierarchies are collapsing. So just as the need for change, ongoing change, is much higher now, traditional ways of leading change are out of date. So how on earth do you actually do it? Because if we don't find a different how, what tends to happen is we will get the same what. So I love this cartoon about how, we get repeating patterns. People often ask me, how do you define change? And I define change as the disturbance of repeating patterns. Change is the disturbance of repeating patterns. And too often we repeat those patterns, thinking we're doing change, but actually we're still stuck in the same old culture. And what these firefighters are not looking at are themselves. So they might be looking at the poor old lady who keeps repeating the cycle, saying, let's send her on a training program about how to, jump out of buildings more effectively. But they're not looking at themselves. The structure they are holding is creating the change. So this session is going to be very personal. We're now going to be looking at what trampoline might you be holding in your own leadership that could be getting in the way of you bringing about change in your organizations. So, one of my big messages is change does start with yourself and understanding what are you doing to trigger the situation. I actually opened the book with the line that my life began in change. The ultimate change. I am an adopted child. Is anybody else here adopted in the audience? We have one adopted. Yeah, there's usually one. So, my life began in a very, very changing situation. There was a dramatic ending, with my biological mother. I had an in-between time when I was in this mother and baby's home. Talk about a VUCA world, at such a young age. And then I actually started life with my new adopted family. Now that has set in my leadership all kinds of triggers about trust, about belonging. So when I'm under stress or anxiety, which change is, I have to recognize what's going on inside me. Can I become more mindful myself? in order that I can be relaxed and inspiring and lead change with other people. So this session is going to become more personal. And it's also going to become, as we've just been introduced, a case study. So Yuri, I think that the session was great this morning about painting that option of B. Where is B right now? How is the world changing? So let me just read out a few paragraphs from my book, Still Moving. And this is a way of introducing Peter, who will be coming on the stage. So here is the conundrum. Imagine this scenario. You have recently been appointed Group CEO of a 100-year-old company facing unprecedented disruptive change, where there will be no revival of the business model that has built its success. There will be no revival of that business model. The market is going to remain volatile and demanding, so that whatever change you bring in has to have both immediate impact, but also an ongoing sustainable character. And the solution is going to be a bit tricky, as there are multiple external stakeholders, including national governments and politicians, who are making decisions and taking actions that influence your company. You are not entirely in control. Moreover, attracting confidence and capital is not going to be easy, with activists threatening your power plants and spraying graffiti on the entrance to your headquarters building. You have lost the trust of the society that you have long served. And given the lower profit levels ahead and current high net debt to EBITDA ratio, you have no cash to buy your way out of the problem. You know that your company's performance is going to get worse before it gets better. And the only pathway to get out of this hole is going to be a long, stony, uncertain, and perilous one. At the same time, your organization and its shareholders are relying on you to find an instant answer to fix the crisis. After 100 years of control, certainty, and a regulated marketplace, surely this company's right to exist is no longer under challenge. There is significant, high-profile, vocal pressure on you to come up with a rescue plan that will provide future certainty. Not only that, the rescue plan has to be one that will cause no discomfort, no sacrifice or betrayal to what has come before. So an easy situation, right? When you turn to your organization, if that's the outside world, you find that you have inherited a leadership culture that looks to the hierarchy to provide the answers. Maybe a clue there in Erin's culture map. And is unused to providing any kind of upward, challenging feedback, and is scared to speak up about the truth. Not only that, you are trying to steer an organization that has horizontal silos, multiple management layers, and via historical M&A, is governed by a panoply of boards and legal entities whose sense of independent entitlement makes it impossible for you to get aligned and speedy decision-making. So this is no imaginary scenario, but the very real situation that my client, a group CEO of a major European company, faced. In the book, because it's all anonymous, I call this chap Pat. Well, his name is not Pat, it's actually Peter, Peter Terium, who is the group CEO of Energy, previously RWE, based in Germany. So I'd now like to welcome Peter Terium onto the stage. So welcome, Peter. The format for our session is going to be like it's a story. It is a narrative. So we've got a few notes, haven't we? We had a couple of whiskies last night in the bar to think about what are we going to say here. But a lot of it is going to be improvised as well. But there will be time also to have a good Q&A with us. So this is now getting personal into the heart of leadership and leading change. So Peter, what we will also be doing as we go through, let me just put up, there is going to be what I call a teachable point of view. So in my book, there are these 6 big messages that are the real keys that my research has shown make a difference in leading large, complex change. But let me first turn to the personal and to the story that Peter brings. And Peter, I think your market cap went from 80 billion to 8 billion. So I think this is called negative exponential.
Yeah,
This is
you
like,
looked at the charts and it was like, this is the wrong way around, you know. We went from 80 to 8 in 3 years or so, and still at the seat. So I loved how you described it, and I was listening to it. I said they probably didn't find somebody else for this job. That's why they took me. But it really was a challenge in 2012 when we started this, and we embarked upon our change journey.
so what was it like, Peter, to come in? I mean, this was a scenario. It sounds very dramatic, but it was a very real scenario.
Yeah.
And what did you do in those first, how did you prepare? How did you prepare? I mean, leadership is about preparation. And how did you prepare yourself for this role? And I think importantly, how did you think about how you wanted to be in this role as a CEO? Because I think how you were inside had a huge impact on then what you did as a change leader.
Well, as you said, the way it was described is literally as it was or as it came. So a true real story. And the advantage I had was that I already was with the company since 10 years. I've been in various divisions in various countries. So not only did I know what was coming about, I also knew the company. And I very much knew that this was much more a cultural issue than only, quote unquote, only a strategic or a restructuring issue. And that's where those things came together. The other thing was, part of the culture, we talked about that, hierarchical. New boss comes in, everybody looks up, and new guy, new ideas, let's listen what he wants. Well, not only did I not have a plan, there was not the ability to create a plan, because the indebtedness was at top level, disruption was going on, and we didn't know, or we couldn't foresee at that moment how our future looked like. So I took the advantage of not having a plan by not giving them the hint that I had a plan, and forced them to work on a few other things, which is the capability to work in this environment of uncertainty, and to not look up, but to develop your own skills. So we very quickly started with working on the how in parallel to the what. There was a few very obvious things we need to do. We divested a few big divisions in order to get cash in the books and to repay a part of the debt. There were some immediate restructuring programs that needed to be done, but in parallel, the how became very important, and I created the pressure on that by not giving them the full-fledged plan. I said, there is no plan, let's work together to create one.
And what did it require of you? Because I recall many leadership meetings where you were put on the spot to say, what is the strategy? What is the vision? Renee yesterday afternoon was talking about the importance of having a vision, and your energy market was so rapidly being disrupted, particularly in Germany with the switch to renewables. As you said, you couldn't have a plan. So how did you actually, and the press were calling for this is a CEO without a strategy. I mean, there was a very vocal pressure on you.
Yep.
But you stood and you were very consistent in saying, no, before the what, before I have the solution on the what, I've got to invest in the how, as you said. So I'm just wondering what it took from you inside, Peter, to be able to face that.
Well, what I saw in the years before was this company was great in planning. They had corporate divisions, they had departments, they had, the problem was just when the plan didn't come through, they made a new plan instead of trying to change reality. And that's why I said just making a plan, is just not doing the job, because as long as reality doesn't move, you're never going to reach to whatever plan that you describe. So it was about the skills and the attitude that were very important from the outset. And just for you to give a bit more flavor, Deborah mentioned it, in complex systems theories, you always have two issues with large companies. It's the horizontal power distance, silo culture as we call it. Just one anecdote, when I joined RWE in 2003, and I talked about, the other department, they said, no, you can't fully talk to them, you need to go 2 layers up, and then the boss talks to the boss, and then 3 layers down. I said, for God's sake, how can you work that company? And then the answer was, this is a company that used to have regional monopolies. So if you don't have an enemy out there, you look for them inside the company. So that was I would say, the perverted version of a silo culture. But the same was on the on the vertical layer. You see very strong bureaucracy, top-down, command and control structures in, for instance, large technical companies. If you, like for instance with RWE, how do you become a board member responsible for operations? Well, you start as a youngster engineer, then you become a department head for engineering, then a plant manager, a division manager, and after you've built power plants for 35 years of your life, you know exactly how to build them. You become a board member, you tell all the others in the organization how to build a power plant because you've built them for 35 years. Now that's a very strong command and control top-down culture, what we had at RWE. But there's another branch where you find this culture, which is in public service. Because in public service, the top sets the policy, the rest of the organization executes the policy. A utility, an energy company like RWE had the best of both worlds. You know, my people were civil servants up till the late 80s, early 90s. So we had the best of both cultures both way around, and I needed to crack that nut on culture. And I consciously did not start with giving them the answers, giving them a plan, but tried to work on developing the skills to create your own plans.
So let's go into a bit about how we did work together, I think, to change the culture. And this is the point about action versus movement. You know, very often we think we're actually doing change, but we're actually staying stuck and not moving. And I remember we talked about one of your people on your team who said the first thing we must do is set up a change department.
Yep.
And that's the irony. So the whole change was about becoming more flexible, more empowered, you know, more decentralized, becoming more innovative using the periphery. And yet the natural tendency was, let's set up a governance structure around the change. You know, so ironically, you know, you were going to manage the change in exactly the same way as you'd always run the business. So we had to do something very, very radically different. So on this being before doing, you know, the whole point here is before you start to do anything, you've got to work on a different way to be. Yep. So if you remember, Peter, some of the early leadership meetings we had where, so Peter took the idea to I'm not going to call the change anything, let's not launch a big change program, but let's change how we run meetings. Let's just experiment with running meetings in a different way. So if you remember at the GEM meetings, you didn't give any theory, but you started to loosen up the group. You know, we didn't have any tables, there were meetings without agendas. Do you have any stories perhaps about how you try to change the culture, not through talking about it,
the point was, even if I said I didn't come up with a plan, I certainly had a game plan in place. Yeah? And that game plan was try to first work against the reflexes. When I was appointed within 4 weeks or 5 weeks, my head of strategy, who was also, you know, my corporate developer, he came up with this plan for, you know, you've said change is important, we need to change, here I have a plan. It's a change department, we need, I think, about 36 people and 4 heads and whatever. So I said, yeah, that's important, but we'll do that later. He was very disappointed because that was his way of working. But you would have created a next silo, which wouldn't help. And the second thing as a reflex is if the boss has an idea, you have all the division heads sending their best people to Harvard, MIT, and Stanford to explain that there is even a better idea, and this idea is not the good one. It puts a lot of energy in the wrong place. So I didn't start with a change approach, although I had one. I just neglected it. What I did is I said, guys, change needs to happen, but we have priorities. We need to work on a few must-win battles, and we need to immediately start at that. What I then did, I took away some of the very simple things to start with. This was a front-loaded organization, PowerPoints from the front, 80 people in the room, all consuming the PowerPoints and making up their own minds. So I took away the seats, I took away the PowerPoints, and we started working with interplanar walls, we started working with different formats. And strange enough, if you use different formats, if you use different tools, you suddenly get very different results. You also, I always call it, my HR department hates me for saying this, but I always call it, our meetings are not a meeting, they are life assessments. If you work together on something, you immediately find out who is engaged, who is not engaged, or maybe even a terrorist, and who is looking for that and tries to find connection. With all my experience, having 80 people in a room and polishing PowerPoints at them, you don't get that differentiation. But working on stuff together, on a question, on an issue, on a problem, how we're going to approach that, that really brings it forward. And that's some of the working formats that we together used in one of the daughter companies where I started with. And it's very often the small things that make it live. It happens in the moment. Like the one anecdote I think you were referring to, we had our first top 300 conference, and we wanted to create one RWE to get rid of the silos. And then we said, consciously said with the name Shields, before it always said, what division are you from? Yeah? So RWE power, RWE systems, RWE retail, RWE what have you. Yeah? And I said, this just enforces the silos. Let's not do that. Yeah? And here is another thing which comes in place, which is the system. Don't think that this is simple, because this is a complex organization, which is a system on its own. And the system started to work. Because when we were there on the day where the conference started, all the name tags were there with the division names on it. So trying to filter out, and someone in purchasing department said, oh, for God's sake, they forgot to put the division names on it. Let's quickly add that, and there was a short order so to get the name tags right. So what you do at that moment is we took the organization team and we said we take a big black stift and we cross out all the division names. So the message we wanted to enforce, we didn't come through firstly, was now enforced even stronger by what the heck have they done? Is this not well organized? I said, no, this is what happens. The system does its work and we need to beat the system. And we got certainly a topic of talking about the silos which normally would not have surfaced. That's not the theory behind the change approach, but it's just an anecdote and an example that you need to use the moments where you can make a shift, where you can create awareness to make again a step forward.
So that maybe brings us on, Peter, to what are the skills needed to lead big change, to lead big complex change well. So you've just been referring to what I would call systemic perceiving, which is one of the interconnected capacities on the quality of being, to actually try to see the system in action, the culture as it's really happening right here, right now. But I remember, and we're going to talk a bit now about the leadership program we brought in to try and actually cultivate these capacities. But let's just start with what the capacities are. And I remember when, Peter, you and I sat down about 3 years ago to talk about the program, and you invited me to be the director of that program. You said, I want mindfulness to be the tent pole of this program. You can do anything you want, Deborah, on this curriculum, and the curriculum was to take the top 360 leaders in RWE through a very, very challenging, innovative leadership development experience. But you actually said to me, it's got to have mindfulness in it. So who here has heard of mindfulness? The bigs, yes, here we go. Talk to me a bit, Peter, about why you wanted mindfulness. And I think there's a bit here about Peter's own personal story that might relate to your response here as well. So why mindfulness?
Yeah, I thought it needed to be the core of the program, not because it was the flavor of the day, and out of the many hands I see, I can notice that it's still the flavor of the day. I myself started with meditation in 2002 because of difficulties in interaction between business life and private life. And I had a lot of benefits of it. I always treasured it as my personal story, my personal thing. But I noticed that it brought not only in private life, but also in business life, a lot of advantages. Getting your head cleared every night, being able to zoom in and zoom out consciously, having a different sense of awareness or sensing things. Really, surprised me, but took benefits into professional life as well. And I think it was something like 8 years later, where I was pinpointed by my HR director and said, how are you doing this? We're all like mads up to here, and you're in the midst of all the storms and the change and everything, and you're like, the rock in the current. You're like in the eye of the storm. And that's why I opened up and I shared a few of those things, and I noticed that there's a lot of advantage in this for individuals, and it reflects into an organization. And given that the change that we were going through was taking people really out of the comfort zone. We were already brought there by a 110-year-old company on the edge of bankruptcy. It was unthinkable. And that's where people get into an comfort zone. And how do you work with being out of the comfort zone? How do you work with being uncomfortable? And we've talked about the system, but the system starts with yourself. It's the system, it's the team, but it's yourself as well. And understanding yourself, reflecting into yourself also has an effect on the system around you. And I think there was a natural need, because of the stress level that we would urge the company and the people to go through, as a kind of a responsibility, to give people help, to aid them, to guide them, to give them tools, how to work with this environment. And I think that's why I thought that mindfulness was the real core. I mean, it has moved beyond from meditation through that period into, a lot of Harvard studies, a lot of scientific foundation. Mind me, this is a 110-year-old German-based company. Coming up with a smoothie idea like mindfulness is a challenge. So we really had to get all the scientific studies behind it and to say, this is good stuff, yeah. And by the way, the Navy SEALs use it. It's something that is not very esoteric. It can lead to results. That's how we got them over the crossing of that, and then entered that as a starting point.
So let me just build now then on this whole notion around you said the change starts with self. And I remember when I was a people director at BBC Worldwide, I also had property and technology in my portfolio as well as HR. And we were managing a massive office relocation from a media centre to a new TV centre for the BBC. And I used to go into these risk committee meetings. And I always thought risk management or risk committee meetings were the most boring meetings in the world. And I came in thinking, gosh, I'm into demanding revolution and this all feels very, very stuck and processy. But one morning I got up to say, maybe the issue is in my own mind and how I'm perceiving this rather than I've got to re-engineer how risk management is actually done, within the BBC. And the moment I started to, and in fact, my personal practice was yoga. So, every morning at least 30 minutes of yoga. And I started to notice that maybe I was projecting onto the situation my own feelings of frustration. And the moment I was able to switch my mind from frustration and irritation to calmness and resourcefulness, it was amazing how the meetings flowed differently. Yeah. So this whole notion is you get what you project. This is the whole notion about being before doing. So if you are in a certain emotional state, that will then, it's like contagious. It'll actually, admit the climate to other people as well. Yeah. So let's now talk about this leadership development experience. So I'd been, in the BBC doing all of this stuff, and then you gave me a call to say, hey Deb, are you happy at the BBC? And I said, yeah, I kind of, I like Top Gear and Sherlock and Dancing with the Stars and all that kind of stuff, and maybe not Jeremy Clarkson for that. And you say, come on, let's do something radical. So I remember, Peter, you said to me, I am taking my leaders into the woods, or into the forest, I think you said, first off. I need to take my leaders into the forest. We need to create a leadership development experience that simulates uncertainty, that simulates not being in control, that simulates feeling disturbed. And I think you did a beauty parade of maybe some of the more conventional providers. So it was going to be more of a talked experience. Let's learn from the gurus about transformation. And your brief to me was, no, let's actually create a living laboratory. Let's actually have leaders go through an experience in which they were going to feel very, very uncomfortable. We even had them, literally we're in the forest down in South Germany where we actually held this as well. So we did something really quite radical. And I remember now, you were on the first wave. So we had 360 leaders in 10 different waves. So every wave that I was running had 36 leaders coming in, all thinking that the change had to be with somebody else rather than the change actually being with themselves. But we did lots of, I think, quite experimental things in the room. So the data about the transformation happened in the room. I think there was only about 5-10% lectures. It was all group dynamics work, what was actually coming up here in the room, doing very, very different things. I remember, Peter, when you came on that first wave, that you also had to think through, am I here as the group CEO, or am I here as Peter Terium? And there's the personal, private, or I'm a leader as well. So do you want to say anything about how we created quite a non-traditional, innovative program, and how you had to be as much a learner on that program as the classic sponsor coming in as the CEO?
I think the first point or part which was important is how do we prepare the groundwork for that? And although I set my head of strategy, we do the change department and the change approach later on, the idea was to somewhat, trick them in, if I may call it like that, against the reflexes of criticizing the change approach. So what I did is, I nailed down the top 50 by saying, guys, we need to talk about change, but let's first look at the immediate priorities and start with them, because before the change process is done and we've developed a new strategy, we're 3 years down the line and it's too late. So we need to start working on some stuff immediately. And if we as a group of leaders can't identify the top 70% or 80%, then we're in the wrong place anyway. And I think we can get that done, and then we start with that, and then in parallel we'll do all the other stuff. So they pretty quickly, because that's a German discipline organization, had a long list of 40 and then drilled it down to 10 and agreed with the 50. These are the top 10s we need to work on. So great, let's take them on. We then sent that up in a kind of a project approach. We had to change workshop format in which we worked on those topics. Now, all change programs start with a disaster because you get the leftovers. It's always difficult to get people on board, and then you get the ones who are available. That's not the ones with whom you win the war, to be very honest. So I then went back to my top leaders and said, oh guys, something's going wrong here, because these are the real top 10 priorities. If I can't get your best people on this priority, we're doing something fundamentally wrong. So that's how I got the best people on board. And then what we saw was with using certain formats, adult learning, off-site learning, of off-site working, and certain tools that we used. We suddenly get, same people, same topic, and suddenly we got results. So I created the curiosity with my top leadership team about what's going on there. Instead of resisting another change approach, they were curious. They said, this is working. No, what is this? What is this about? And then I said, it's a certain change approach. There might be better ones, but if we all use the same one, we can learn from each other. We all use the same vocabulary. We can talk with each other. And that was the groundwork. And then I had the forum prepared to get into the leadership session, because I said, if this needs to work company-wide, it starts at the top or it doesn't start at all. It's what you call the tone of the top. And that's why I had to be in there, and my board members had to be in there, need to do some convincing work by saying, this is not something you do to the others, because if everybody does it to the others, nobody does it to somebody. So we need to start at the top by getting ourselves also in that leadership program. Now, how do you convince a very proud 110-year-old company that your leadership is suck? So we called it next level leadership. Leadership is good, and it was perfect for the past, but it's not going to bring us to the future. So we need to go to the next level, and that's what we all need to go through. And then the first wave where I was on was for me personally, a very challenging one, because I gave Deborah and a small design team the order. I said, I want to have this based around mindfulness, zooming in, zooming out, getting rid of the autopilot, getting a different level of conversation into the organization. And it needs to have health elements in there, because what you eat, how you sleep, what you drink has an immediate impact on the stress environment that you work in. And we need to do this in a business set context. This is not, just studying things to learn something. You need to practice it. And she came back from the States, and I said, I've been to Harvard, been to, Goldman, to whoever. It doesn't exist. So I said, I can't take no for an answer, so we'll set it up ourselves. So in the first wave where I was in, I was not only the CEO, I was also a personal participant, and I was the guy, who set the program up. And it was the first wave from something that hadn't existed before. And that in a context where everybody says, this is a company in big trouble. Do we take our top 350 2 weeks out of business to work on this? So this had to be right, and that was me. If you want to get a feeling for dealing with being out of your comfort zone, that was one, also for me personal. And that's the learning, because all of your participants had certain moments in which they really were physically out of their comfort zone. And experiencing and feeling how that feels and how you personally deal with it makes you and helps you to understand how other people on different parts in the organization have to deal with it. And that's leadership. And it's not having taught or learned it with the head. It's also by experiencing it and then dealing with it. And trying to learn from how to deal with it, and then take that to real life. Take that out of this 2 weeks back into business. And by the way, the 2 weeks were set up in 3 modules. We started with the 3-day program, then a full week offsite 2 months later, and then another 2 or 3 days recap at the end of the day. So that's the adult learning principle of it behind it. But maybe you can say a bit more, because you really have been, as a program director, heavily involved, and those modules were very well interconnected to each other as well.
Yeah. I mean, I saw 360 leaders go through the classic change curve, in terms of shock, horror, anger, and it's nothing to do with me, and then going through. So we did have the 3 modules. People thought, why have we got to spend so much time away? As you say, when we got this cash crisis and bankruptcy and whatever. But this is the whole now, make disturbance your friend. So I think we framed it that we were going to do something different and challenging. What we did between the modules was also important. So between modules 1 and module 2, we did what we called external foraging, which was the groups of your leaders decided where are the future contexts that most matter for the future of our company. And this happened to be the energy, market. And what organizations do we want to go and visit that might actually give us some lessons and learnings? And they had to self-organize. So again, we didn't say, right, we've lined up visits to Google or Samsung or Amazon or whatever, these big sort of sexy digital companies. You've got to come up with where you need to go. So I think some of your leaders went to visit politicians who were actively almost campaigning against your company, went to organizations like Greenpeace and some of the NGOs who were, closed down of your dirty coal-fired, power plants, things like that. And they'd never done that before, actually going outside their own company's walls. So I did find that one of the biggest things that worked well was going outside the walled city of RWE and looking at the future, but doing it in teams and doing it in a self-organized way. What we did between Module 2 and Module 3 was rapid prototyping. And I'm sure a lot of you here have heard of design thinking, rapid prototyping. So this was a company, a business, but also a national culture that liked precision and control.
Yes.
So the notion of rapid prototyping is, well, you just got to come up with a new way of running your process. And we called it the 0.7. Is this going to be 0.7 right? It doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. And I remember that was so countercultural, and that made a lot of people quite disturbed, yeah. That they've got to actually do something in a rough and ready way, or rather than in a perfectly engineered way. So I think some of the disturbance was about going outside and doing things very different and very revolutionary. And that, do you want to say something?
Yeah, one thing to add there, and I forgot to mention that, the bypass via the projects and the top 10 priorities also had a second purpose. What are the patterns, what is the DNA, what are the mental models that stand in the way of progress? I had a gut feel of about getting 60 or 70% of them right, but I didn't have them all on the radar. So we used the first waves of the projects that we did by taking inventory, full stock of all the mental models and prioritizing them that stood in the way. Now the two that you were reflecting to, one was lack of outward orientation. No surprise, no enemies out there, it's inward focused. And the other one was if you build nuclear power plants, you don't prototype, you don't experiment. It needs to be 110% precise. That doesn't work in the exponential world, in all the changes that we're going through. So you need to have a different approach. So that were, for instance, the things that we built into the program, because normally you get the top 350 leaders of that time, 65, 70,000 people company. They send people to a course to learn that, but they don't do it themselves. So when we had the top 350 in groups of 36, in one room, and we asked the question, when have you yourself last time been to a client? When was it the last time that you yourself went out and listened firsthand and heard, not via a project or a delegation or what have you, And that's where we really encourage them to go out and to feel how it feels, to hear how people think, and talk about you, and to take that inside the company, to start work with that. I think the other element of the groups of 36, they were very well designed. We always had at least 3 hierarchical levels in that group. So we recreated the system out there in that group of 36. 36 is big enough to have a representation of the whole company, and then surprise, surprise, what all of us always said that, this is the mental model we always see. Duck and dive until the initiative from Group Center is over, and then we can go on with the business again. Or the lack of outward orientation, don't prototype. So when we started working on business topics, the breakdown of the change process happened in that group of 36. And we say, oh guys, what's happening here? And they say, oh, holy shit, we're doing ourselves what we always tell or say that other people in the organization are doing. And at that moment, when you're doing it yourself, you're creating the system or you're enforcing the system, that's where you can start changing it. And making yourself aware, yourself and the team in there, the 36, what they do to the organization. And don't underestimate, what the top does has a bigger effect on the organization as what an individual on the bottom does.
That reminds me, we often use meeting observers there as well. We actually ask participants to observe the RWE culture in the room. So rather than cognitively talking about these mental models, people were observing in this room right here, right now, where are our silos? In this room right now, are we externally oriented? I remember one morning when we arrived, we actually had the 36 chairs. Everybody came in and there was a big circle of chairs, no tables at all. And the 36 chairs were all facing outward. And I remember the people filing in thinking, oh, can't we move the chair to sort of, turn inward? So we did lots of things that actually made people uncomfortable in the room itself. I'm just going to mention one final thing about what we did to create this disturbance and focus on being, and then we'll look a bit about the results and the outcomes. But I talked about my adoption and how, as a leader in executive positions myself, how I have to always be aware of my triggers. And how to consciously switch my brain from being anxious to curious. Latest neuroscience shows that the amygdala in the brain fires up all of these emotional highways, and if the right prefrontal cortex is all fired up and anxious, you chemically cannot be curious at the same time as being anxious as well. So every leader coming on this program had to write their origin story. And their origin story was, how have I been formed as a leader? So it's not my CV, it's not from I was 2 weeks old until however old I am now. But what have been the pivotal life experiences without which I would not be the leader I am today? And we also asked people to write about, and who have been the guiding lights or mentors who have helped you along that path as well. So it wasn't like an emotional journey line or whatever. We really called it the origin story, and we help people see that unless you know what your origin story is, you can't also then help a company discover its own origin story. And if you can't tune into yourself, again, neurochemically, you can't have empathy for another person unless you're aware of it's all the mirror neurons. And secondly, we ask people to share their origin stories. So it's scary enough, I think, for people to write them. But really importantly, we broke the group of 36 leaders into 6 groups of 6, into what we call peer groups. So what might have felt very dangerous and risky in front of the large group, every evening you met in your peer groups, and in the peer groups, these origin stories. In fact, it was the very, very first thing that was done. And I remember leaders who had said, I've been in the same department with this person for 25, 30 years. I never knew this about you. And I feel ashamed that I didn't know that about your life story. And now I understand your leadership in a totally different way. So the capacity, I think, to have empathy and to know your own triggers, and it developed trust in an instant.
Yeah. And the great thing of also the peer groups were across hierarchy. And that is, when we talk about, I started with that vertical power distance, the only way to break down hierarchy is doing it.
Yeah.
And having a board member sitting with a second level and a third level in the organization in this peer group, sharing their story of origin, finding out he's just a human being as I am, and he has different triggers because he has a different origin. And what it has created, next to the concrete business that we worked on, a kind of an informal network within the top 350 that goes across hierarchy, across silos, that has an intensity which would never have reached in any other format.
Mm. So I think, let's move on to the results now, and then we'll open it up for questions, is that one person once said to me, Peter, that this intervention changed the internal society of RWE.
Yep.
It perceptibly changed the atmosphere. It was very hard in the initial waves because we were seen to be the crazy dancers. I mean, even journalists in the press came to, I remember they came down to Wonderath at one stage, and I was written about negatively. You were written, why are engineers, mindfully eating raisins, and what has that got to do with business and stuff? So we were pilloried in the press for doing such a radically different form of leadership development.
Just one word on Wonderath,
Yeah.
Because there was a discussion in the board, if we take our top 350, these are the most expensive people. We need to treasure them because they are important, we need to bring them forward.
Go to a schloss somewhere.
So we need to go somewhere, 5-star plus, and we need to demonstrate that we really treasure our people. So we had an intensive discussion about it. At the end of the day, we ended up in our blue-collar training center in Wonderath. And it sent out a message, but it also created this family atmosphere. We had, and the people in Wonderad, it was an in-house training center, they loved it. The board is coming. They felt as much praise as they never have had before. We got a separate wing, where we had our sessions and we could, do group working. We had our rooms in the same building, and we had people from the Works Council, bumping into, holy shit, I only knew him from the press. He's one of the board members, and now he's here, and I meet him in the floor or in the bar or what have you. So that was an element in there, and I'm pretty sure if we wouldn't have done that, the press would have killed us only on the fancy stuff, and it would have not reached us anything.
I do remember some of your colleagues, esteemed colleagues, complaining about the beds to me as well.
Oh yeah, it's great.
Deborah, I haven't slept in a single bed for whatever. I said, make disturbance your friend.
Yeah.
You're about to take your company into huge discomfort, so maybe a single bed is like a metaphor for so get used to feeling uncomfortable. But maybe, Peter, now let's move to just if you can do a few sentences. I mean, people might be aware of what the structural solution was. So RWE took the decision to split, to restructure the company, and then IPO the renewables and the so-called the green part of your industry. But do you just want to just briefly talk about the speed? Because today is about fast action. That's the theme of today. How quickly your company moved to the new world.
Yeah. In order to get speed, it's important to get it from the leadership down to the floor. I think that's the most important phase. All that we've described, in length, is just the prep work. Change hasn't happened when it hasn't reached the front line. So what we are now doing, with the full support of the top 350, with good working examples, we are rolling out our change program. We call it New Way of Working, NWOW, and it's a combination of end-to-end lean, plus a very important component of behavioral change. It has a leadership and direction module in there, where we put basically the elements of our leadership program in. We have now covered almost 40,000 people of the 60 that were originally with the group. And what we've also done is we are using the principles of how to work in real life. And the best example is our IPO. We had the fact that we came to it and the organization supported it was also a major change of mindset. It's not something that the bankers, the consultants and the board have thought of, what are they doing? They were basically demanding for it. They said, it's the right time, everybody needs to go its own way and split up the company. Board decision was on December the 12th, 2015. And I rang the bell at the Frankfurt Stock Exchange on October the 8th of the year after. In those 10 months, we've done a split up of a 60,000 people company in 2 independent companies, separated all the support functions, got all the people, a role and lined up in that new company, created the history, what you need to have for the prospectus for the stock exchange. We did all the roadshows in preparation of the IPO, and we had the biggest IPO in Germany since 16 years, the second biggest in the world. Unfortunately, China Savings Bank went out with, 40 billion. We couldn't match that one. But it was a great success. And within such a short period was only possible because we did a few things that we developed in NLL. Lead through purpose. The IPO is the purpose. Don't lead through, giving them all the details. Get to the table who can contribute to the solution, irrespective of the hierarchical position that he has. And use the hierarchy to support and to get speed in, not to create bureaucracy. And with that, and with the full and the support of it, we really did, one of the remarkable IPOs that has happened.
Yeah, so it had a business outcome.
Yep.
Thank you very much, Peter. So I think in the remaining time that we have, which I think we have another 10 minutes, let's now open it up to Q&A. We have a microphone for Yuri.
Wow, this is very impressive. So congrats. Is there anything that you would change based on hindsight, if any? And if so, why and how?
Good question. I I probably would have been more forcefully in selecting the tourists from the terrorists, or the terrorists from the tourists. That's one thing. Being more strict in who is not contributing, not because he can't, but because he won't. I think that's an element. Then we would have created more speed. I think I would have set up a point that we didn't talk about, but the innovation initiative, the platform that I started 2 years ago. Basically, it's a prolongation of the change, because the change we went through was getting from command and control, directive, towards, we call that setting up the borders, masterful change. Because taking a company from command and control to emerging changes is too big a step. The in-between step is you start with defining the borders, the boundaries. I don't know the answer, but it needs to fit within, this is the context within it can work, and then you try to fill that out. The next step is emerging change, which we've started up on the innovation platform. I probably would have started with experimenting with that a bit quicker, because all the developments that you've described are really going to hit this branch. I think the energy sector is the next one to be Uberized. Blockchain is a very important issue in our sector. Disruption by taking all of the conventional power plants out, getting renewables in, means the system needs to be digital. You cannot manage so many solar panels and windmills just through a manual control room. You need to do that digital, or maybe even with artificial intelligence, to anticipate changes in weather and therefore changes in electricity production. And the customer needs to be a part of the solution. He needs to consume electricity when it's abundant, and he needs to not consume it when there's no wind or no sun. Now, you can only do that by energy management and digital solutions. So I probably would have started that a bit earlier.
Can I just say something on that, Peter? That I think that the innovation could not take off until you had sufficiently named the pain and the price of what you had to decommission. And we found time and again with these waves of leaders, unless you had really got to grips with what had to end, it was really hard to start the innovation. Yep. And often we just think of change as about the new stuff that's coming in rather than what you had to decommission. And that wasn't just power plants, that was also mindset. So I think that was something that but let's, thank you, Yuri. So who else might have a question about how do you transform a big entity into quite a radically different business model?
Yeah. A few down here and back there. Oh.
Thank you. Heinrich Sharp, I'm a leadership consultant, and my question is that I understood you run a program for all your leadership team. And in my experience, there should be a significant amount of voluntarily, doing things voluntarily. People need to do this from their own motivation. So on the one hand, there's a program. On the other hand is the idea of doing things voluntarily. So how do you balance this when pushing this program into your organization?
It's a very difficult one, because you can only get into the voluntary mode if there's sufficient critical mass that supports it. And how do you get to that critical mass?
You talk about the different waves, because suddenly volunteers wanted to come on, didn't we?
Well, the first thing is I created a pool by setting up what we would call deliver breakthrough projects. Those top 10 priorities, they started working on that, and that was a huge success. We call it biggest bang for the buck. We work on the priorities with the best people, so you do get results. How does that come? Well, they use certain work methods, they use certain what have you. And then the top leadership team said, if this is good for the teams, it can be good for us. Can we do something about it? So that's how we created the pool, to get them over the threshold. Certainly when we started mapping out the program, and people heard, they're chewing a resin for 2 minutes, and then suddenly the resin tastes different as when you just, choke and it. So it got, a lot of negative press as well. But after the first, second wave, third wave, there was the tipping point where there was so much positive vibe and positive news coming out of that people said, can I be on? When is the next wave? Why am I not in? And that's where the point created. But the starting point was indeed creating pull rather than push, and to then get them over the momentum of this is something weird, this is strange, this is different, into people are so astonished and positive about it, I want to be part of it.
Thank you.
There's a lady in the front here, I think, yeah.
I have a question to, I imagine that when you have a company with that long history and very heavy traditions, that you might have a board of directors with similar traits. And I'm curious as to how you manage to manage that, or what resistance, or if not, what happened in the board?
Yeah, that's pretty simple. I didn't tell them. And came up
Subterfuge.
with results, and then explained how I got there. Now this is fortunate because in Germany you have the two-tier system. So my board, non-executive board, supervisory board, is not involved in day-to-day business, in how I do things and what I do. So that's good. The other thing is my management board. There's some advantages in being the boss. So at least. In Germany, they do listen to you, and the Dutch version of it is at least you get the benefit of the doubt. So, but then you also have to, come up with things that they share and are involved in. There's certainly, a bit of the whole toolbox of experience. We did the first 2 waves of these projects, to deliver breakthrough performance projects. Third wave, I made 2 of my board colleagues responsible for that as a sponsor, because it was good enough to run on its own. I had a good program management in there, so making them the sponsors, I couldn't get any better proximity to this than them being directly involved and me going back on a distance. And that's how I also created pull on the board level that I needed as a support to do the next level leadership training. Intensive, interesting discussions, on what does it cost and can we take our people off out there, until I'm not going to jump on a table to dance my name, this weird stuff. This needs to be down to earth. So it hasn't been all easy, but we got there eventually.
I think Peter once described it to me, particularly in relation to your top team, about acupuncture. So Peter works in a way it's very subtle. If ever you've had acupuncture or alternative medicine, but you seem to know exactly. You don't push things onto people, but you know exactly when to put in the needle at the right point on the pressure. And I think how you work your top team was very skillful. Yeah,
a colleague of mine called it, what you do is organizational acupuncture. You give a peaks here, and a peaks there, and suddenly the whole system starts moving. And there is an advantage if you know the system and you're a bit sensitive to where do I need to get the right small needle, better than the big hammer. And then the system starts to move on its own. It's also a combination of being intelligent and lazy. That's a more smarter way of getting things moving, because pushing the system is a very demanding job.
I think we're out of time, but maybe one more question. Yeah.
So first of all, thank you very much for sharing this this story and this massive change in RWE. Now, directors normally have a lot of power, but in Germany I also know that the Workers' Council have a lot of power, both indirectly and directly. How did you manage to pull this whole change around?
Well, it was about their future and the workers' future, that's one thing. So I didn't have to explain that the house was burning, It was burning lichterloh, as they call it in German. So that was one element which helped. The other thing was they don't have any say on what you do with the non-tariff people. So leadership, but also middle management, is out of their scope. And that's where you start to work on. As I said, it starts at the top or it doesn't start at all. And if you then get the right momentum in, and the leaders are convincing towards the Works Council on, this also needs to go further down, then that momentum is already started, and it's unbreakable then at that moment.
Okay. Thank you very much, Peter. I think we have to wrap up now. Just a small plug here for my book, Still Moving. And there's a leaflet for it on your table. But a lot of the story that we've hadn't had a lot of time today, but I hope you've enjoyed the hour. A lot of it is written up in this book. So if you're wanting any more clues about how to lead change, then I'd invite you to get hold of this. But Peter, thank you very much. And I think now over to the other Peter to wrap up the session.
Thank you very much, Peter Terium and Deborah Rowland.
I need 30 more seconds, I'll tell you. I'm gonna hijack 30 more seconds from you guys, because there's one thing that I personally would like to share with you. It's something that I started last week. It's an initiative, Business for Europe. And I'm spearheading that. I have by now already 10 CEOs of other companies like BMW, Deutsche Bank, Volkswagen, ThyssenKrupp on board. And we're basically saying Europe is in a crisis, in a confidence crisis, maybe in an existential crisis. And if the rules and the society that has delivered us the prosperity in Europe that we've had the last 50, 60 years, if that's at jeopardy, then also the basis of working as a company is at jeopardy. So it's up to us, companies and CEOs, to speak up, to speak with our people, to explain what are the benefits of Europe. They're quite numerous. And I know not everything in Brussels is perfect, and a lot of things that need to be improved. But losing all of that is of much greater danger than what we have at currently. So I would really like you to encourage you. It's Business for Europe. It's in the Twitter. It's on our internet site. It will be all over the press in the coming weeks and months to come. But the silent majority needs to speak up, because whatever we have taken and had for granted in the last years is at jeopardy if we don't take control on that one. So I really would like to urge you, your leaders in your individual companies, to pick this up and take responsibility for this one. Very thanks.
Right. Okay, thank you very much.
Off we go, yeah?
Okay, what a great morning. So it's going to be a fantastic afternoon coming up. Lunchtime now, be back here at 2 o'clock. Enjoy your food.